The morning sun barely touched the glass towers of Manhattan when 7-year-old Emma Rodriguez pressed her small, dusty feet against the cold marble floor of Sterling Enterprises, her torn yellow dress hanging loose on her thin frame, her dark eyes wide with fear and determination as she clutched a crumpled piece of paper in her trembling hands, and the security guard Tony Martinez looked down at her with a mixture of pity and confusion, his hand already moving toward his radio to call for backup because street children didn't belong in buildings where monthly rent could feed a family for years. But Emma stepped forward with a courage that seemed impossible for someone so small and whispered, "Please sir, I need to see Mr. Sterling. My mama is dying and I don't have time to be scared anymore." The lobby smelled of expensive perfume and fresh coffee, of success and power and everything Emma had never known, and she could feel dozens of eyes on her as executives in pristine suits hurried past, their shoes clicking against the floor like judgmental metronomes, some averting their gaze entirely while others stared with open disgust, and one woman in a red blazer actually pulled her designer handbag closer as if poverty were contagious. But Emma had walked 6 miles through the city. Before dawn, her feet bleeding from the broken glass she'd stepped over in the alley where she and her mother lived in a cardboard shelter, and she wasn't going to turn back now, not when her mother Elena had been coughing blood for 3 days. Not when the free clinic had turned them away because they needed insurance papers Emma didn't understand. Not when her mother had whispered through cracked lips last night, "Mi amor, I'm so sorry I couldn't give you a better life." And Emma had decided right then that she would save her mother, even if it meant walking into the scariest building in the world, and facing the man everyone said had a heart of ice. Tony the security guard crouched down, his weathered face softening despite his training, and he said gently, "Sweetheart, Mr. Sterling doesn't see walk-ins, especially not." But he stopped himself before saying especially not street kids, because something in Emma's eyes made him feel ashamed, and Emma thrust the crumpled paper toward him, her voice shaking but determined as she said, "I drew this for him. I'm a really good artist, and I can work, I can clean or carry things or draw pictures. For his office, I just need money for the hospital. Please, I'm not begging, I want to earn it, I want a job." The paper was a crayon drawing on the back of a discarded McDonald's bag, showing a little girl holding hands with a woman under a rainbow, and despite its childish execution there was something haunting about it, something that captured both hope and desperation in a way that made Tony's throat tight, and he was about to tell her that Mr. Sterling was already in his office on the 47th floor preparing for a board meeting that would determine the fate of a billion-dollar merger, that Jonathan Sterling hadn't smiled in the 3 years since his own daughter died in a car accident, that the man was essentially a walking statue who fired people for breathing too loudly. But before Tony could say any of this, a cold voice cut through the lobby like a blade. "What is this commotion?" Jonathan Sterling himself stood by the elevator, his 6'3" frame imposing in a charcoal Tom Ford suit that cost more than most cars, his steel-gray eyes scanning the scene with the clinical detachment of someone who viewed human problems as mere statistical inefficiencies, his jaw set in a permanent expression of controlled displeasure, and at 42 years old he was one of the youngest self-made billionaires in the country, known for his ruthless business tactics and complete lack of sentimentality, a man who had built an empire by never letting emotions cloud his judgment. And the last thing he needed on the morning of the biggest deal of his career was a dirty child disrupting his lobby. Emma turned slowly, her small body trembling as she met his gaze, and for a moment the entire lobby seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if the little girl would run or cry or collapse, but instead she walked straight toward him with her drawing held out like a peace offering, her bare feet leaving small dusty prints on his perfect marble floor, and she said in a voice that was barely a whisper but somehow carried across the silent space, "Mr. Sterling, my name is Emma Rodriguez and I'm 7 years old and I'm really good at drawing and cleaning and I learn fast and I'll work harder than anyone you've ever met because my mama is dying in a place with broken windows and rats and she coughs blood every night and the hospital won't help us and I know you're very busy and important but please give me a job. I don't want money for free, I want to earn it, I want to work." Something flickered across Jonathan's face, so brief that most people missed it, a micro-expression of pain that vanished as quickly as it appeared, and his hand twitched slightly as if he wanted to reach for something that was no longer there. And for just a fraction of a second he wasn't looking at Emma Rodriguez but at another little girl with dark hair and bright eyes who used to draw him pictures and leave them on his desk, pictures he'd collected in a leather portfolio that now sat in a drawer he couldn't bear to open, and his daughter Sarah had been 7 when she died, 7 years old with her whole life ahead of her. And he'd been in a meeting just like the one he was about to attend when he got the call. And he'd built his fortune even higher since then, piling success upon success as if achievement could fill the void. But standing here now looking at this desperate child with her crayon drawing and her bleeding feet, something cracked in the walls he'd built around his heart. "Security," Jonathan said, his voice sharp and professional, and Emma's face crumpled, her last hope visibly draining away as tears began to slide down her dusty cheeks, and Tony stepped forward reluctantly, his hand gentle on her shoulder as he prepared to escort her out, but then Jonathan continued, "Bring her to my office, have someone from medical check her feet, and order breakfast from the plaza, whatever a 7-year-old eats." And the lobby erupted in barely concealed gasps because Jonathan Sterling never deviated from schedule, never showed mercy, never let personal matters interfere with business, and his assistant Cynthia Morrison, a sharp-featured woman in her 50s who had worked for him for 15 years and secretly harbored bitter resentment about being passed over for promotion, shot him a look of pure shock, mixed with something darker, something that looked almost like anger because if Jonathan Sterling was capable of compassion then why had he never shown it to her? Why had he never noticed her sacrifices and late nights and unwavering loyalty? Emma stared at Jonathan with her mouth open, tears still on her cheeks but her expression transforming from despair to disbelief to cautious hope, and she whispered, "Really?" And Jonathan nodded once, a curt professional gesture that betrayed none of the chaos in his mind, and he turned and walked toward the elevator without another word, his posture rigid and controlled, but his hands were shaking slightly and he clenched them into fists as he pressed the button for the 47th floor. And behind him he could hear Tony gently telling Emma that everything would be okay, that Mr. Sterling was a good man deep down even if he didn't show it, and Jonathan wanted to laugh at that because he wasn't a good man. He was a man who had failed to protect the one person who mattered most, a man who had chosen a conference call over a school pickup and let his wife drive instead, a man who had spent 3 years turning himself into something cold and efficient because feeling anything at all was too dangerous. The elevator ride lasted 47 seconds, and in that time Jonathan's mind raced through the implications of his decision, calculating the risk to his reputation, the potential complications, the board meeting that was starting in 30 minutes where he needed to be sharp and focused, not distracted by a street child and her dying mother, but every time he tried to construct a rational argument for sending Emma away. He saw Sarah's face, heard her laugh, remembered the last drawing she'd made him showing the two of them holding hands under a sun she'd colored bright purple, and he'd told her he was too busy to look at it properly, had promised to admire it later, and later never came because later she was gone and the drawing was in that leather portfolio he couldn't open. His office occupied the entire 47th floor, a sprawling space of floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, furnished with mid-century modern pieces that were beautiful and completely impersonal, no family photos, no mementos, nothing that suggested a human being worked here rather than a very sophisticated robot, and his desk was a slab of black marble that reflected his image like dark water, and he stood behind it now, hands pressed flat against the cool stone, trying to center himself before Emma arrived, trying to remember who he was supposed to be. Cynthia entered first, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood, her expression tight with disapproval, and she said, "Jonathan, the board is assembling, we need you in conference room A in 28 minutes, and I really must advise against this distraction. You know how crucial this merger is, we can't afford any." But Jonathan held up one hand, silencing her, and he said quietly, "I know what's at stake, Cynthia. I built this company. I understand the stakes better than anyone, but sometimes there are things that matter more than money." And Cynthia's eyes widened because she had never, ever heard Jonathan Sterling say anything like that, and a hot flash of jealousy surged through her because this child, this nobody from the street, had accomplished in 5 minutes what Cynthia had failed to do in 15 years. She had made Jonathan Sterling feel something, and Cynthia had spent years trying to be perfect, trying to be indispensable, trying to make him see her as more than just an assistant. And this ragged little girl with her stupid crayon drawing had managed to crack his armor without even trying. Emma entered the office slowly, her eyes wide as she took in the impossible luxury around her. The city spread out below like a glittering toy set, the leather furniture that probably cost more than every possession her mother had ever owned, and Tony walked beside her, his hand on her shoulder protective and reassuring, and behind them came Dr. Lisa Chun from the building's medical office, carrying a first aid kit and looking curious about why she'd been summoned to treat a child who clearly didn't belong in Sterling Enterprises, and Emma's feet left small bloody prints on Jonathan's pristine floor. And he found himself not caring about the mess, not caring about anything except the way she looked so small and scared and brave all at once, and he gestured to the leather couch by the window, his voice gentler than he'd used in years as he said, "Sit down, Emma, let Dr. Chun look at your feet, and then we'll talk about this job you want." Emma sat carefully on the edge of the couch as if afraid she might damage it, her thin legs dangling above the floor, and Dr. Chun knelt in front of her with professional kindness, cleaning the cuts and glass fragments from her feet while making soft sympathetic noises, and Emma winced but didn't cry, her jaw set with determination that reminded Jonathan so much of Sarah that he had to turn away, pretending to look at something on his phone but really just trying to compose himself, and Cynthia watched this tableau with growing resentment, her mind already calculating how she could use this situation to her advantage, how she could paint Jonathan as either foolishly sentimental or inappropriately involved with a child, how she could whisper to the board members that perhaps their CEO was losing his edge, becoming unreliable, and maybe it was time for new leadership, maybe someone who had been loyal for 15 years deserved a chance to prove themselves. A young man from the plaza arrived with breakfast on a silver cart, scrambled eggs and fresh fruit and chocolate croissants that smelled like heaven, and Emma's stomach growled audibly, and Jonathan realized she was probably starving, that she'd likely walked all this way without eating, and he said, "Please eat." And Emma looked at him with such gratitude that it physically hurt, and she picked up a croissant with both hands as if it were made of gold, biting into it slowly, her eyes closing with pleasure at the taste of real butter and chocolate, and she chewed carefully, making it last, and Jonathan remembered how Sarah used to steal croissants from his breakfast and hide them in her backpack for later, how she'd leave crumbs everywhere and laugh when he pretended to be annoyed, and he had to grip the edge of his desk to keep himself steady because the memories were coming too fast, too sharp, too real. "Tell me about your mother," Jonathan said, his voice carefully neutral, and Emma swallowed her bite of croissant and looked down at her bandaged feet, her small voice filling the huge office. "Her name is Elena Rodriguez and she's 28 years old and she's the best mama in the whole world. She used to work 3 jobs cleaning offices and restaurants so I could go to school and have food, but then she got sick. She started coughing and couldn't breathe right. And the free clinic said it was probably pneumonia, but they couldn't do tests without insurance, and she kept working anyway because we needed money, but last week she collapsed at the restaurant and they fired her because she fell and broke some plates, and now she can't work and she's getting sicker, and the shelter where we were staying kicked us out because she was coughing too much and keeping other people awake. So now we sleep in an alley behind a Chinese restaurant where the owner sometimes gives us leftover rice. And last night she was coughing so much blood and she couldn't stop, and she held my hand and told me she was sorry she was a bad mother, and I told her she was wrong. She's the best mother ever. And I decided I would save her because if I didn't, who would?" The words tumbled out in a rush, unfiltered and raw, and Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back fiercely, and Jonathan felt something breaking inside him, all the carefully constructed walls crumbling, because he had billions of dollars and all the power in the world and he hadn't been able to save his daughter. But maybe he could save someone else's daughter. Maybe he could keep another little girl from losing her mother. Maybe that could mean something. "Cynthia," Jonathan said, his voice sharp with decision, and Cynthia jumped slightly, pulled from her dark thoughts, and Jonathan continued, "Cancel the board meeting or push it back 2 hours, I don't care which, and call Mount Sinai Hospital, speak to Dr. Richard Torres, tell him I need him to personally admit a patient today, full workup, whatever is needed, expenses irrelevant, and send my car to." He looked at Emma. "Where is your mother now?" Emma whispered, "St. James Free Clinic on 9th Avenue. They let her wait in the hall but they won't treat her without papers," and Jonathan nodded. "Send my car to St. James, have them bring Elena Rodriguez to Mount Sinai immediately. Tell Torres I want the best possible care, and Cynthia, if anyone questions this, tell them it's a personal matter and they can speak to me directly if they have concerns." Cynthia's face had gone white, her lips pressed into a thin line, and she said tightly, "Jonathan, the board won't understand. Postponing this meeting could jeopardize the entire merger. We're talking about billions of dollars and you want to risk it for." But Jonathan turned to face her fully, his gray eyes cold and hard, and he said in a voice that could freeze fire, "I want to risk it for a human life, yes, that's exactly what I want to do. And if the board doesn't understand that, then perhaps they don't understand what kind of company I built. And if this merger falls apart because I chose to help a dying woman and her daughter, then it wasn't a merger worth having. Now do what I asked or find another job. Those are your only options." Cynthia flinched as if he'd slapped her, and for a moment pure hatred flashed in her eyes, but she nodded stiffly and left the office, her heels striking the floor like gunshots, and in her mind she was already planning her revenge, already composing the email she would send to board members, already planting seeds of doubt about Jonathan's competence and stability, because if he could discard her so easily after 15 years of devoted service, then she would show him exactly what betrayal felt like. She would take everything he'd built and watch it crumble. Emma had stopped eating, her small hands clasped in her lap, tears streaming down her face, and she whispered, "You're really going to help my mama?" And Jonathan nodded, and Emma slid off the couch and ran to him, throwing her small arms around his waist, her face pressed against his expensive suit, and she sobbed, "Thank you, thank you, thank you, you're like an angel, you're the best person in the whole world." And Jonathan stood frozen, his arms at his sides because he hadn't been hugged. In 3 years hadn't let anyone close enough to touch him, but slowly, carefully, he brought his hands down and patted Emma's back awkwardly, and something warm and painful bloomed in his chest, something he'd thought was dead forever, and he realized he was crying too, silent tears sliding down his face, and Tony, who was still standing by the door, wiped at his own eyes and thought that maybe miracles did happen, maybe broken people could heal, maybe it wasn't too late for any of them. Dr. Chun finished bandaging Emma's feet and stood, her expression thoughtful, and she said quietly, "Mr. Sterling, the child is malnourished and dehydrated. She needs more than just breakfast, she needs consistent care and nutrition, and I'd recommend a full medical evaluation as well." And Jonathan nodded, his hand still resting on Emma's head, and he said, "Make it happen, whatever she needs, and set up a room where she can rest while we're taking care of her mother, somewhere comfortable, and have someone bring her clean clothes, proper shoes, everything." And Dr. Chan smiled, the first genuine smile she'd given in this building in years, and she said, "It would be my pleasure, Mr. Sterling." And she took Emma's hand gently and said, "Come with me, sweetie, let's get you cleaned up and comfortable, and by the time we're done, your mama will be in the best hospital in the city getting the best care possible." Emma looked back at Jonathan, her eyes still wet but shining with something like worship, and she said, "Will I see you again?" And Jonathan nodded, "I promise." And he meant it, even though he didn't understand why, even though logic said he should just write a check and move on with his life. But something had changed in him. Some fundamental shift had occurred the moment this brave little girl had walked into his lobby, asking not for charity but for dignity, asking not for a handout but for a job, and he realized that for 3 years he'd been living like a ghost, going through the motions, building his fortune higher and higher as if money could fill the void Sarah had left. But money meant nothing, success meant nothing, power meant nothing if you couldn't use it to help the people who desperately needed help. And maybe Sarah had died for a reason, maybe her death was supposed to teach him something, and maybe that lesson was standing right in front of him in the form of a 7-year-old girl with bleeding feet and an unbreakable spirit. After Emma left with Dr. Chan, Jonathan stood alone in his office, the city spread out below him indifferent and glittering, and he picked up the crayon drawing Emma had given him, the little girl and her mother holding hands under a rainbow, and he smoothed it out carefully, and then he opened his drawer, the one he never opened, and he took out the leather portfolio, and he opened it for the first time in 3 years, and Sarah's drawings spilled out, dozens of them, stick figures and bright colors and misspelled words. "I love you, Daddy," written in purple crayon. "You're my hero," with a picture of him wearing a cape. "Best daddy ever," with a gold star. And he sat down in his chair and he cried, really cried, the kind of deep wrenching sobs he'd been holding back for 3 years, and he let himself feel the pain and the loss and the guilt and the rage, and when he was done, when he'd purged himself of all the poison he'd been carrying, he placed Emma's drawing in the portfolio next to Sarah's, and he closed it carefully, and he stood up and he went to wash his face, and when he looked in the mirror of his private bathroom, he saw something different in his eyes, something that looked almost like hope. The board meeting happened 2 hours later as Cynthia had rescheduled it, and Jonathan walked into conference room A where 12 powerful executives sat around a table that probably cost more than Emma's mother had earned in her entire life, and James Caldwell, the chairman of the board, a silver-haired man in his 60s who had known Jonathan since he was starting out, looked at him with concern and said, "Jonathan, we heard you had some kind of emergency, is everything all right?" And Jonathan sat down at the head of the table, his posture perfect and professional, and he said, "Everything is fine, I apologize for the delay, there was a personal matter that required immediate attention, but I'm fully prepared to discuss the merger." And he opened his presentation folder, and for the next 90 minutes he was brilliant, sharp, focused, dismantling objections and building consensus, and by the end of it the merger was approved unanimously. And as the board members filed out, James lingered and he said quietly, "You seem different, Jonathan, more present somehow. I don't know what happened this morning, but whatever it was, it's good. You've been operating like a machine for 3 years and frankly we've all been worried. But today I saw a glimpse of the man I used to know." And Jonathan nodded, grateful, and he said, "I think I'm starting to remember who I used to be." And James clasped his shoulder and left, and Jonathan was alone again. But this time the solitude felt different, less like a prison and more like a choice. He went to check on Emma and found her in a small conference room that Dr. Chun had converted into a temporary bedroom, and Emma was wearing new clothes, pink leggings and a soft white sweater, and her feet were properly bandaged in new sneakers, and her hair had been washed and braided, and she looked transformed, still tiny and fragile but no longer quite so desperate, and she was drawing again, this time with a proper art kit someone had bought her, colored pencils and thick paper. And when Jonathan entered she looked up and smiled, a real smile that lit up her whole face, and she said, "Mr. Sterling, look, I'm drawing you." And she held up a picture that showed a very tall man with gray hair standing next to a very small girl with dark hair, and both of them were smiling, and above them she'd written in careful letters, "My hero." And Jonathan felt his throat close up again, and he sat down next to her and he said, "Emma, I have some news about your mother." Emma's whole body tensed, her pencil frozen in midair, and she looked at him with such fear that he quickly added, "Good news, she's at the hospital now, the doctors are taking care of her, and they say she has severe pneumonia and she's very weak, but they caught it in time, with treatment she should recover fully, but she'll need to stay in the hospital for at least 2 weeks, maybe longer." And Emma burst into tears, but this time they were tears of relief, and she threw herself at Jonathan again, and this time he was ready and he wrapped his arms around her properly, and he held her while she cried, and he said softly, "You saved her, Emma, you were so brave, you walked miles through the city and you came to a scary building and you asked for help even though you were terrified, and because of your courage, your mother is going to live, you should be so proud of yourself." And Emma pulled back, her face wet, and she said, "Can I see her?" And Jonathan nodded. "Of course, I'll take you myself." The drive to Mount Sinai Hospital took 20 minutes. And Emma sat in the back of Jonathan's town car pressed against the window, her nose leaving smudges on the glass as she stared at the city passing by, and she said, "I've never been in a car this nice, it's like a movie." And Jonathan's driver Marcus, a kind man in his 50s who had worked for Jonathan for 10 years, caught his eye in the rearview mirror and smiled, and Jonathan realized how much he'd missed these small human moments, how he'd isolated himself so completely that he'd forgotten what it felt like to share joy with someone. And Emma kept up a running commentary about everything she saw. "Look at that dog, he's so fluffy. Oh, that building is so tall. Do you think people live at the top? Wouldn't that be scary? What if the elevator broke?" And Jonathan found himself answering her questions patiently, even laughing at some of her observations, and Marcus caught his eye again and mouthed, "She's wonderful." And Jonathan nodded, thinking that wonderful didn't even begin to cover it. Mount Sinai's private wing was a different world from the free clinic where Elena had been waiting, all soft lighting and quiet efficiency, nurses moving like gentle ghosts, and Dr. Richard Torres met them at the entrance, a distinguished man in his early 50s with kind eyes and silver temples, and he shook Jonathan's hand warmly because they'd known each other for years. Jonathan had donated millions to the hospital, and Torres said, "Jonathan, good to see you, we have Mrs. Rodriguez in a private room, we've started her on 4 antibiotics and she's responding well. She was severely dehydrated and malnourished, which complicated the pneumonia, but we expect a full recovery, though it will take time." And Emma tugged on Torres's coat and said, "Is she awake? Can I see her?" And Torres crouched down to Emma's level, his manner gentle, and he said, "She's awake and she's asking for you, she's very worried about you, but I need to prepare you, she has tubes and monitors attached to her, and she looks very tired, but all of that is helping her get better, okay?" And Emma nodded seriously, and Torres led them down a quiet hallway to room 447. Elena Rodriguez was lying in a white bed that looked enormous around her thin frame, and she was only 28 but she looked 50, her face gaunt and pale, her dark hair limp against the pillow, and when Emma walked in she tried to sit up, her eyes wide with panic and love, and she said in a hoarse voice, "Emma, mi cielo, what happened? Where were you? I woke up and you were gone and I was so scared." And Emma ran to her mother's bedside, and Elena pulled her close with trembling arms, and Emma said, "Mama, I saved you. I went to see a billionaire and I asked him for a job and he said yes and he brought you here and the doctors are going to make you better." And Elena looked over Emma's head at Jonathan standing in the doorway, and her expression was a mixture of gratitude and fear and confusion, and she said, "Sir, I don't understand. Why would you help us? We're nobody, we have nothing." And Jonathan stepped into the room, his hands in his pockets, and he said quietly, "You have everything, Mrs. Rodriguez. You have a daughter who loves you so much that she walked across the city barefoot and bleeding to save you, who faced her fears and asked a stranger for help, who didn't beg but demanded dignity. And that kind of love and courage is worth more than all the money in the world. And I lost my daughter 3 years ago, and I couldn't save her, but I can save you, and maybe that means something. Maybe that's why Emma found her way to my building this morning." Elena started crying, silent tears sliding down her face, and she said, "I'm so sorry about your daughter. I can't imagine. Emma is my whole world. Without her I have nothing, and I've tried so hard to give her a good life but I've failed. She deserves so much better than sleeping in alleys and going hungry, and I'm so ashamed." And Jonathan shook his head and he said, "You haven't failed, you've done the impossible. You've raised an extraordinary child in circumstances that would break most people, and she's kind and brave and smart and loving, and that's your success, not your failure. And from now on you don't have to do it alone. I'm going to help you, both of you, because that's what my daughter would have wanted me to do. She would have loved Emma, they would have been friends." Dr. Torres cleared his throat gently and said, "Mrs. Rodriguez needs to rest, but Emma can stay if she wants. We can bring in a cot." And Emma looked at her mother hopefully, and Elena nodded, and Emma climbed carefully onto the bed, curling up next to her mother like a small cat, and Elena wrapped her arms around her daughter and kissed her head, and she whispered, "Te amo, mi amor," and Emma whispered back, "Te amo, mama," and Jonathan felt his heart breaking and healing at the same time, and he said, "I'll come back tomorrow if there's anything you need, anything at all, the nurses can reach me." And Elena said, "Mr. Sterling, I don't know how to thank you." And Jonathan said, "Raise your daughter, watch her grow up, give her the life she deserves, that's all the thanks I need." And he left before he started crying again. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange new rhythm for Jonathan. He still ran his company, still attended meetings and made deals, but now he also visited the hospital every day, bringing Emma books and art supplies, bringing Elena warm meals from good restaurants because hospital food was terrible, and he found himself telling them stories about Sarah, sharing memories he'd locked away for 3 years, and Emma listened with rapt attention, and she said things like, "Sarah sounds like she was really cool, I wish I could have met her," and "I bet she's watching you from heaven and she's really proud of you for helping us." And somehow these simple statements from a 7-year-old helped heal wounds that 3 years of isolation hadn't touched. He also started making arrangements for their future, setting up a trust fund for Emma's education, finding Elena a job in his company's mailroom which wasn't glamorous but had full benefits and steady hours, securing them a small but safe apartment in a decent neighborhood. And when he told Elena about all this, she cried and said, "This is too much, we can't accept all this, it's charity and we don't." But Jonathan cut her off gently and he said, "It's not charity, it's investment. I'm investing in Emma's future because I believe she's going to do extraordinary things, and I'm giving you a job that you'll work at and earn your salary, and the apartment is reasonably priced, you'll pay rent from your salary. This is about giving you a foundation so you can build your own success, not about giving you handouts." And Elena understood and she nodded and she said, "I'll make you proud, Mr. Sterling. I'll work harder than anyone, I promise." And Jonathan believed her because he'd seen where her daughter got her determination. But not everyone was happy about these developments. Cynthia Morrison watched Jonathan's transformation with growing fury. She saw him smiling more, saw him leaving early to visit the hospital, saw him actually taking lunch breaks to eat with Emma in the company cafeteria. And she couldn't stand it, couldn't stand that this child had accomplished what she couldn't, had softened Jonathan's heart and made him human again. And Cynthia had spent 15 years hoping that eventually Jonathan would notice her, would see that she was more than just an assistant, that maybe they could be something more. And now she saw that door closing forever, and her resentment curdled into something darker, something dangerous, and she started digging into Elena Rodriguez's background, searching for anything she could use to poison Jonathan against them, and she spent her evenings scrolling through databases and public records, determined to find some scandal, some secret that would prove they were unworthy of Jonathan's attention. 3 weeks after that first morning, Elena was released from the hospital, fully recovered though still thin and weak, and Jonathan arranged for Marcus to drive them to their new apartment, A sunny one-bedroom in Queens with working heat and clean floors and windows that actually closed. And Emma ran through the space like she'd discovered Narnia, touching everything, opening every cabinet, jumping on the couch, and Elena stood in the middle of the living room with her hands over her mouth, crying again, and she said, "I never thought we'd have a real home, I never dared to hope." And Jonathan, who had accompanied them to make sure everything was set up properly, said, "Everyone deserves a home, Mrs. Rodriguez, and this is just the beginning. Emma is going to start at PS 112 next week. I've arranged everything with the school, and there's a free after-school art program at the community center 3 blocks away. And your job starts on Monday. The HR department has all your paperwork ready." And Elena grabbed his hands, her grip surprisingly strong, and she said, "How do I ever repay this kindness?" And Jonathan said, "You already have. You gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever. You reminded me why life matters, why money only has value if you use it to help people, and that's worth more than anything." Emma, who had been exploring the bedroom, came running back with a drawing she must have worked on in secret, and she handed it to Jonathan shyly, and it was a family portrait, a tall man and a small woman and a little girl all holding hands, and above them she'd written, "Thank you for being my angel," and underneath in smaller letters, "I love you, Mr. Sterling." And Jonathan's vision blurred, and he knelt down so he was eye level with Emma, and he said, "Emma, can I tell you something?" And she nodded, and he said, "For 3 years I thought my life was over. I thought the best part of me died with my daughter, and I was just going through the motions making money because I didn't know what else to do. But then you walked into my building with your bloody feet and your crayon drawing and your incredible courage, and you reminded me that life is still worth living, that there are still people who need help and still beautiful things in this world. And you saved me just as much as I saved your mother, so thank you, Emma Rodriguez, for being brave enough to ask for help, and for letting me be part of your life." Emma hugged him, and this time Jonathan hugged her back without hesitation, and Elena watched them with tears streaming down her face, and she thought that maybe God did exist after all, maybe miracles were real, maybe the world wasn't entirely cruel, and she sent up a silent prayer of gratitude to whatever force had guided her daughter to that building on that morning. But while they were celebrating this new beginning, Cynthia Morrison was in her office late at night, and she'd finally found what she was looking for, a document from a private adoption agency, and her eyes widened as she read it, and a slow, cruel smile spread across her face because she'd discovered that Emma wasn't Elena's biological daughter, that Elena had adopted her from an agency 7 years ago, and the birth mother was listed as unknown, the father as unknown, and Cynthia's mind raced with possibilities about how she could use this information, how she could twist it into something ugly, how she could make Jonathan question everything, and she took photos of the documents with her phone, and she started drafting an anonymous email to the board members, carefully worded to plant seeds of doubt, concerns about CEO judgment regarding adopted street child with unknown parentage, and questions about appropriate boundaries between executive and charity cases, and she felt powerful for the first time in months, felt like she was taking back control, and she didn't stop to think about the cruelty of what she was doing, didn't consider that she was trying to destroy the happiness of a woman who'd nearly died and a child who'd done nothing wrong, because all Cynthia could see was her own pain, her own rejection, her own bitter disappointment that after 15 years of loyalty she'd been cast aside for a little girl with a crayon drawing. The first month passed like a dream for Emma and Elena. Elena started her job in the mailroom, and true to her word she worked harder than anyone, arriving early and staying late, learning everyone's names and always volunteering for extra shifts. And her co-workers loved her because she was kind and grateful and never complained. And Emma started school and discovered that she was actually quite smart despite having missed so much education. And her teacher, Mrs. Patricia Chan, a warm woman in her 40s, noticed Emma's talent for art and gave her extra supplies and encouragement. And Emma made friends for the first time in her life, real friends who invited her to birthday parties and play dates. And she would come home each day bursting with stories about what she'd learned and who she'd played with, and Elena would listen with tears of joy in her eyes because this was everything she'd ever wanted for her daughter, normalcy and safety in childhood. And Jonathan visited them every Sunday for dinner, and these became the highlight of everyone's week. Elena would cook simple meals, rice and beans and chicken, nothing fancy but made with love, and they would sit around the small kitchen table and talk and laugh, and Jonathan found himself relaxing in a way he never did anywhere else, found himself sharing stories about Sarah that he'd never told anyone, and Emma would ask endless questions about his daughter. What was her favorite color? And did she like animals? And What games did you play together? And Jonathan would answer each one patiently, and somehow talking about Sarah didn't hurt quite as much anymore. Somehow the memories were becoming sweet instead of only painful. But the peace couldn't last forever. Cynthia's poison was working its way through the company like a virus. She'd sent her carefully crafted emails to 3 key board members who she knew were already skeptical of Jonathan's leadership, and she'd included the adoption documents as attachments, and she'd framed everything in terms of concern for the company, and questions about judgment and potential liability. And one of the board members, Gerald Hutchison, a ruthless corporate raider in his 60s who'd always resented Jonathan's success, saw an opportunity to push Jonathan out and take control himself, and he started making calls, scheduling private meetings, building a coalition of dissent, and whispers started circulating through the executive floors. Have you heard about Sterling's obsession with this street kid? And apparently she's not even the mother's real daughter, and some people are saying he's having a breakdown, and the CEO spending all his time with a random child? It's inappropriate at best, disturbing at worst. And the gossip spread like wildfire, and Jonathan started noticing odd looks in the hallways, conversations that stopped when he approached, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that told him something was wrong. It came to a head on a Tuesday morning exactly 6 weeks after Emma had first walked into his building. Jonathan arrived at work to find an emergency board meeting had been called without his knowledge, and when he walked into the conference room, all 12 board members were already seated, their expressions grave, and Gerald Hutchison sat at the head of the table where Jonathan usually sat, and Gerald said with false concern, "Jonathan, thank you for joining us. Please sit down. We need to discuss some troubling matters that have come to our attention." And Jonathan's jaw tightened because he recognized a coup attempt when he saw one, and he sat down calmly, his posture perfect, his face revealing nothing, and he said, "By all means, Gerald, share these troubling matters." And Gerald pulled out a folder, the same adoption documents Cynthia had found, and he slid them across the table and he said, "We've learned that you've been spending significant company time and personal attention on a child from the streets, and that you've given her mother a job, secured them housing, and essentially adopted them as your personal charity project. And while we appreciate compassion, Jonathan, we're concerned about your judgment, about whether you're thinking clearly, about whether your grief over your daughter's death has clouded your professional abilities, and these documents raise additional questions. The child isn't even biologically related to the woman claiming to be her mother. We don't know who this child really is. What if this is some kind of con? What if they're taking advantage of your emotional vulnerability? And frankly, several board members feel that your recent behavior suggests you may need to step back, take some time off, let someone else lead the company for a while." The words hung in the air like a physical attack, and Jonathan felt rage building in his chest, white-hot and consuming. And he looked around the table at faces he'd known for years, people he'd made wealthy beyond their dreams, and he said in a voice of deadly calm, "Let me make sure I understand. You're suggesting that because I helped a dying woman and her daughter, because I showed basic human compassion, because I remembered that there are things more important than quarterly earnings, that I'm somehow unfit to lead this company?" And Gerald said smoothly, "We're suggesting that you're emotionally compromised, that you're making decisions based on personal grief rather than sound judgment, and that perhaps you need support." And Jonathan laughed, a harsh sound without humor, and he said, "Support, that's an interesting word, Gerald. What you mean is you want me out so you can take over, and you're using a 7-year-old child as your weapon. You're trying to paint my compassion as weakness, my humanity as instability. Well, let me tell you what I think about that." And he stood up, placing his hands flat on the table, his gray eyes fierce and blazing, and he said, "I built this company from nothing. I turned a small investment firm into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, and I did it by being smarter and tougher and more strategic than anyone else in this industry. And yes, 3 years ago I lost my daughter, and I handled it by shutting down emotionally, by becoming a machine, by focusing only on profit and growth, and you all benefited from that. You made fortunes while I slowly destroyed myself, and then 6 weeks ago a brave little girl walked into my building and reminded me what actually matters, and helping her and her mother hasn't made me weaker. It's made me stronger. It's given me purpose again. It's reminded me why I built this company in the first place, not just to accumulate wealth but to have the power to make a real difference in people's lives. And if you think that makes me unfit to lead, then you don't understand leadership at all." James Caldwell, the chairman who had always supported Jonathan, cleared his throat and said, "Jonathan, no one is questioning your competence or your track record, but you have to admit that your behavior has been unusual. The canceled meetings, the hospital visits, the personal involvement with people you barely know. It's a departure from your normal patterns, and some of us are worried about you, not as CEO but as a person, as a friend. And Jonathan's expression softened slightly as he looked at James and he said, I appreciate your concern, James, truly, but I need you to understand something. For 3 years I've been a ghost, operating on autopilot, and I was good at my job but I was dead inside, and Emma and Elena didn't take something away from me, they gave something back. They reminded me what it feels like to care about someone, to have purpose beyond profit, and I'm better at my job now than I was 6 weeks ago because I have something to live for again, something to work toward beyond just the next deal. And if you can't see that, if you really think I need to step down, then put it to a vote right now, and if you vote me out I'll leave, but I won't apologize for helping people who needed help. I won't apologize for being human. The room fell silent, board members exchanging glances, and Gerald looked triumphant, certain he had the votes. But then Patricia Chan, a brilliant investor in her 50s who rarely spoke at meetings, said quietly, I'd like to share something. 6 weeks ago my assistant mentioned that Jonathan Sterling smiled at her in the elevator, actually smiled and asked how her day was going, and she was so shocked she called me immediately because in 3 years he'd never acknowledged her existence. And yesterday I was in the lobby and I saw him with a little girl, they were laughing about something, and I saw other employees watching him with this expression of relief, like they'd been holding their breath for years and could finally exhale. And I thought, this is what a leader should look like, human and approachable and capable of joy, not a robot in an expensive suit. And I've reviewed the financials from the past 6 weeks and our performance hasn't dropped. In fact, we've exceeded projections, so clearly Jonathan's personal life isn't interfering with his professional abilities. And honestly, Gerald, I think this coup attempt says more about your ambitions than Jonathan's competence. So I vote to keep Jonathan as CEO. And I suggest we focus on actual business issues rather than manufacturing crises. Several other board members nodded, and Martha Williams, a tough woman in her 60s who controlled a major investment fund, said, I agree with Patricia, and furthermore, I'd like to know who leaked private information about Jonathan's personal life to this board, because that feels like a violation of privacy and trust, and I'd like to see consequences for whoever did that. And she looked directly at Cynthia, who was sitting in the corner taking minutes. And Cynthia's face went pale, and suddenly the momentum in the room shifted, and Gerald realized he'd miscalculated badly, and one by one the board members voiced their support for Jonathan, until even Gerald had to admit defeat, and James said formally, all in favor of keeping Jonathan Sterling as CEO? And 11 hands went up, only Gerald abstained, and James said, motion passes, Jonathan remains CEO. Meeting adjourned. And as people filed out, several of them stopped to shake Jonathan's hand or squeeze his shoulder, and he felt a wave of gratitude for these people who'd chosen to see his humanity as strength rather than weakness. After the boardroom cleared, only James and Jonathan remained, and James said, that was close. You have powerful enemies, Jonathan, people who want what you have, and they'll use anything against you, even a child, so be careful. And Jonathan nodded and he said, thank you for your support, James, I won't forget it. And James smiled and he said, I meant what I said in that earlier conversation. You seem more alive now, more like the Jonathan I met 15 years ago when you were just starting out, hungry and passionate and deeply human. Success changed you, made you hard, and grief made you harder. But this child and her mother, they've softened you again in all the right ways, so don't let the bastards win. Keep being human, keep caring about people. That's what real leadership looks like. And he left, and Jonathan sat alone in the conference room for a long time, thinking about how close he'd come to losing everything, and thinking about how the things that mattered most to him now weren't things that could be threatened by a board vote, because even if they'd fired him, he'd still have his Sunday dinners with Emma and Elena, he'd still have the warmth of their kitchen, and the sound of Emma's laughter, and the feeling of being part of something bigger than himself. But now he had to deal with Cynthia, and he called her into his office, and when she entered she looked defiant and frightened in equal measure, and Jonathan said quietly, how long have you worked for me, Cynthia? And she said, 15 years, and Jonathan nodded and he said, 15 years of loyalty, or so I thought, but apparently I was wrong. Apparently you've been so consumed by resentment that you were willing to try to destroy me, to hurt an innocent woman and child, to leak private information to board members who wanted my job, and I need to understand why. What did I do that hurt you so badly that you would betray me like this? And Cynthia's facade cracked, and tears started streaming down her face, and she said, you never saw me, Jonathan, not once in 15 years. I worked so hard for you. I gave up my personal life. I was there every late night and every weekend. I learned everything about you, your coffee order and your schedule and your preferences, and I Thought eventually you'd notice me, really notice me, but you never did, and then your daughter died and you became even more distant. And I thought maybe if I just kept being perfect, kept being indispensable, you'd finally see me as more than just an assistant, but instead you notice some random child from the street. You open your heart to her in ways you never opened it to me, and it's not fair. I earned your attention. I deserved your compassion. But this girl just walks in with a crayon, drawing, and suddenly you're capable of feeling again. And I hated her for that. I hated both of them for having what I couldn't have. And I wanted to take it away. I wanted to hurt you the way you'd hurt me by not seeing me all these years. Jonathan listened to this confession with a mixture of sadness and regret, and he said gently, "Cynthia, I'm sorry if I made you feel invisible. That was never my intention. You've been an excellent assistant and I valued your work. But you're right that I didn't see you as anything more than that. And I'm sorry if you had hopes for something else, but those feelings weren't reciprocated and never would have been, and what you did was wrong. You tried to hurt people who'd done nothing to you. You tried to destroy something good and pure because you were jealous, and I understand pain. I understand how it can make you do things you wouldn't normally do, but understanding doesn't excuse it. And I can't have someone I don't trust in my inner circle, so I'm going to give you two choices. You can resign effective immediately with 6 months severance and a neutral reference, or I can fire you for cause with no severance and a reference that tells the truth about what you did. Which option would you prefer?" Cynthia wiped her eyes and she said bitterly, "You're being generous, more generous than I deserve. I'll take the resignation." And Jonathan nodded and he said, "I hope you find happiness, Cynthia, I really do, and I hope you learn from this. Hope you understand that you can't manipulate people into loving you. You can't destroy other people's joy just because you're unhappy, and I hope someday you find what you're looking for, but you won't find it here." And Cynthia nodded and left without another word, and Jonathan felt exhausted but also relieved, because he'd removed a source of toxicity from his life, and he could move forward now without constantly watching his back. That evening Jonathan went to Elena and Emma's apartment for dinner as usual, and he decided not to tell them about the board meeting or Cynthia's betrayal because they didn't need that darkness in their lives. They'd had enough darkness already. But when he walked in, Emma took one look at him and said, "You look sad, Mr. Sterling. Did something bad happen?" And Jonathan was startled by her perceptiveness, and he sat down on their couch and said, "Some people at my work tried to make trouble today, but it's all resolved now, nothing for you to worry about." But Emma climbed up next to him and took his hand, her small fingers wrapping around his much larger ones, and she said seriously, "Were they mean to you because of us?" And Jonathan started to deny it, but then he remembered that Emma was smart and deserved honesty, so he said, "Some people didn't understand why I wanted to help you and your mother. They thought it meant I wasn't doing my job well. But they were wrong, and now they know they were wrong and everything is fine." And Emma frowned and she said, "I don't want you to get in trouble because of me. Maybe we should go away so people won't be mad at you anymore." And Jonathan's heart clenched and he pulled her close and he said, "Emma Rodriguez, you listen to me. You and your mother are the best things that have happened to me in 3 years. You gave me back my life. You made me remember how to be human, and I would fight 1,000 battles at work if it meant I got to keep having dinner with you every Sunday, so don't you ever think about leaving. You're stuck with me now, okay?" And Emma hugged him tight and she whispered, "Okay, but if anyone is ever mean to you again because of us, you tell me and I'll draw them a really mean picture." And Jonathan laughed, actually laughed, and Elena came out of the kitchen wiping her hands on a towel and she said, "What's so funny?" And Jonathan said, "Your daughter just threatened to weaponize her art skills on my behalf." And Elena smiled and she said, "Well, she's very protective of the people she loves." And there was a weight to that last word, love, and Jonathan realized that somewhere along the way this had become love, not romantic love but something just as powerful, familial love, chosen family. And he looked at these two people who'd been strangers 6 weeks ago and who now felt essential to his existence, and he thought that this was what healing looked like, this was what it meant to live again. The weeks turned into months and Jonathan's life developed a new rhythm that felt sustainable and right. He was still brilliant at his job, still closing deals and growing the company, but now he had balance, he had something to care about beyond spreadsheets and stock prices, and he started implementing new policies at Sterling Enterprises: better healthcare for lower-level employees, childcare subsidies, tuition reimbursement programs, because Emma and Elena had taught him that poverty wasn't a moral failing, it was a systematic problem that people in power had the responsibility to address. And his employees noticed these changes and morale improved dramatically, and productivity actually went up because people felt valued and cared for, and the board couldn't argue with the results even if some of them grumbled about socialist policies. And Jonathan didn't care what they called it, He called it being human. Emma thrived in school, her grades were excellent and her artwork was getting more sophisticated, and Mrs. Chun recommended her for a gifted program, and Emma was selected, and she came home so proud, bursting with excitement, and she showed Jonathan her acceptance letter, and he felt pride swelling in his chest like he was her actual father, and he realized that in many ways he was becoming a father figure to her, and the thought didn't scare him the way it might have a few months ago. Instead, it felt right and natural, and Elena noticed too. Noticed the way Jonathan's face lit up when Emma talked, the way he listened to every word she said with complete attention, the way he'd started keeping her drawings in his office next to Sarah's, creating a gallery that honored both the daughter he'd lost and the girl who'd helped him heal. On the 6-month anniversary of that first morning when Emma had walked into his building, Jonathan did something he'd been planning for weeks. He'd worked with his lawyers and social workers and made all the arrangements, and that Sunday at dinner he handed Elena an envelope, and she opened it with trembling hands, and inside were legal documents making her his personal life manager with a substantial salary and full benefits, essentially creating a position that would allow her to organize his charitable work and personal affairs. And Elena stared at the papers in shock and she said, "Jonathan, this is too much, I can't accept this, it's too generous." But Jonathan said, "It's not generous, it's strategic. I've decided to create a foundation in Sarah's name, dedicated to helping single mothers and their children who are facing poverty and medical crises, and I need someone to run it who understands what it's like, who has lived that experience and survived it. And that person is you, Elena. You're smart and hardworking and compassionate, and you'll make sure the foundation actually helps people instead of just being another tax write-off. And this position will allow you to do meaningful work while also having time for Emma. The hours are flexible, and you can work from home most days. And I really hope you'll say yes because I can't think of anyone better for this role." Elena was crying again, but these were happy tears, and she said, "Of course I'll say yes, of course, Jonathan, thank you for believing in me, for giving me a chance to do something that matters." And Emma, who had been listening quietly, said, "Mama, does this mean we're really going to stay here forever? We don't have to move or be afraid anymore?" And Elena pulled her daughter close and she said, "Yes, mi amor, we're home now, we're really truly home. And we're never going to be scared or hungry or cold again. We have a family now, we have Jonathan." And she looked at Jonathan when she said this, and there was something in her eyes that was deeper than gratitude, something that looked like affection or maybe even love, and Jonathan felt his heart skip because Elena was beautiful, not just physically, although she was, her health restored and her eyes bright and alive, but beautiful in her strength and resilience and kindness, and he realized with a start that he was attracted to her. That somewhere along the way his feelings had shifted from simple compassion to something more complex and potentially dangerous, because she'd been vulnerable and dependent on him and he didn't want to take advantage of that power dynamic, didn't want to ruin the perfect balance they'd achieved. So Jonathan buried those feelings, pushed them down and ignored them, and he focused on the foundation work, and over the next few months the Sarah Sterling Foundation took shape, and Elena proved to be brilliant at it. She had a natural gift for identifying families who truly needed help versus those who might be scamming the system, and she created processes that were both efficient and compassionate, and the foundation started helping dozens of families, then hundreds, providing medical care and housing assistance and job training, and Jonathan watched Elena come alive in this role, watched her confidence grow and her smile become more frequent, and he fell deeper in love with her even though he tried not to. Even though he told himself it was inappropriate and complicated and potentially destructive. Emma's 8th birthday was approaching, and she mentioned casually one day that she'd never had a real birthday party, and Jonathan immediately started planning the biggest, most elaborate party possible, but Elena gently pulled him aside and said, "Jonathan, that's so sweet, but Emma doesn't need elaborate, she just needs special, something small and meaningful with the people she loves." And Jonathan realized Elena was right, and together they planned a small party at their apartment, just a few of Emma's school friends and Mrs. Chun and Dr. Torres and Marcus the driver and Tony the security guard who had become Emma's friend that first day. And they decorated the apartment with streamers and balloons, and Jonathan hired a magician because what 8-year-old doesn't love magic, and Elena baked a chocolate cake from scratch, and when Emma walked in after school and saw everything, her face transformed into pure joy and she screamed with delight and hugged everyone. And the party was chaotic and loud and perfect, and at one point Jonathan looked across the crowded living room and caught Elena's eye, and she smiled at him, a soft warm smile that made his heart race, and he wondered if maybe she felt something too, or if he was just projecting his own feelings onto her gratitude. The party was winding down, kids being picked up by their parents, and Emma was opening presents, and she'd gotten coloring books and art supplies and a new backpack. And then Jonathan brought out his gift, and it was a large flat package wrapped in silver paper, and Emma tore into it with enthusiasm, and it was a framed collage that Jonathan had made himself, combining Emma's drawings with photos of the three of them from the past 6 months. And in the center was that first crayon drawing she'd given him, the one that had started everything, and around it were pictures of them at the hospital and at dinners and at the park, creating a visual timeline of how they'd become a family. And Emma stared at it with tears in her eyes and she said, "This is the best present ever, it's our family." And Jonathan said, "Yes, it is, you and your mother and me, we're a family, maybe not a traditional one but a real one." And Emma threw her arms around him, and Elena joined the hug, and the three of them stood there in the middle of the messy apartment surrounded by birthday decorations and wrapping paper, and Jonathan felt complete in a way he hadn't since before Sarah died. And he thought that maybe this was what people meant when they talked about second chances. Maybe life really could give you another chance at happiness if you were brave enough to accept it. That night after Emma had gone to bed exhausted and happy, Jonathan and Elena cleaned up together, and they moved around the small kitchen in comfortable silence, washing dishes and putting away leftover cake, and Elena said quietly, "Jonathan, can I ask you something?" And he nodded and she said, "Why did you really help us that first day? I know you said it reminded you of Sarah, but it was more than that, wasn't it?" And Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, drawing a plate carefully, and then he said, "The night before Emma came to my building, I was standing on my balcony 47 floors up, and I was thinking about how easy it would be to just step off, to end the emptiness and the pain, and I didn't do it, not because I wanted to live but because I was afraid of how much it would hurt, and I went to bed feeling like my life was over even though my heart was still beating. And then the next morning this tiny brave girl walked into my lobby asking not for charity but for dignity, asking for a job, showing more courage at 7 years old than I'd shown in 3 years. And I realized that if she could be that brave, if she could fight that hard for someone she loved, then maybe I could too, maybe I could find a reason to keep living. And you and Emma gave me that reason. You saved my life as much as I saved your mother's, and I will never, ever be able to repay that debt." Elena's eyes were shining with tears, and she reached out and took his hand, her touch gentle but electric, and she said, "Jonathan, you're a good man, a truly good man, and I need you to know that what I feel for you isn't just gratitude. It's more than that, it's deeper than that, and I know the power dynamic is complicated and I know you might not feel the same way, but I needed to tell you because life is too short to leave important things unsaid. I've learned that the hard way." And Jonathan's heart was pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it, and he squeezed her hand and he said, "Elena, I've been falling in love with you for months, but I didn't want to say anything because I didn't want you to feel pressured, didn't want you to think you owed me anything beyond friendship. You've been through so much and I wanted you to have space to heal and grow without any expectations from me. But God, Elena, you're extraordinary, you're strong and kind and beautiful, and you've made me feel alive again, and I love you and Emma both, you're my family, and if you'll have me I'd like to make that official someday, not right now because we need time to build this right, but someday if you'll give me a chance." Elena pulled him toward her and kissed him, soft and sweet and full of promise, and when they broke apart she was smiling through tears and she said, "We'll give you all the chances in the world, Jonathan Sterling, because you gave us everything, you gave us life and hope and a future, and I promise we'll spend the rest of our lives making you as happy as you've made us." And they kissed again, longer this time, and in the next room Emma had been awake the whole time, listening at her bedroom door, and she smiled to herself and went back to bed, drawing in her head the picture she would make tomorrow, a picture of their family with a new caption, "Forever." Moral of the story: never judge someone by their circumstances or appearance, because everyone has a story and everyone has value. And sometimes the people who seem to have nothing are the ones who can teach us the most about courage and love and what really matters in life. And true wealth isn't measured in dollars but in the connections we make and the lives we touch. And healing doesn't happen in isolation but in community, through loving and being loved. And second chances are real if we're brave enough to take them, so open your heart to unexpected blessings, help those who need help, and remember that a single act of kindness can change everything. Not just for the person you help but for yourself as well. Because in saving others we often save ourselves. If you enjoyed this emotional journey, please like and share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that kindness and compassion still exist in this world. And comment below what lesson touched your heart most. Was it Emma's courage, Jonathan's transformation, or Elena's strength? Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories that celebrate the best of humanity and remind us all that love and hope can triumph over even the darkest circumstances. Because together we can build a world where no child has to beg for help, where no mother has to choose between feeding her daughter and seeking medical care, where compassion is valued as highly as profit, and where every person is treated with dignity and respect regardless of their circumstances. Thank you for reading. Thank you for caring. And remember to spread kindness wherever you go, because you never know whose life you might change with a single act of compassion.